Hello, welcome back. Tonight, we journey into Alaska's frozen heart, a place where time stands still and the past refuses to stay buried. 8 chilling tales await you, each a testament to the fact that some stories don't end when the people do. In this episode, we'll venture into ghost towns where whispers echo in empty halls and figures linger in the shadows. These aren't just spooky legends. They're harrowing accounts from those who dared to step into places where the boundary between our world and the next is perilously thin. From spectral miners working a claim long since exhausted to the mournful dance of a bride who never had her wedding. These are stories of forgotten souls still bound to a land that claimed them. What happens when the living intrude on the work of the dead? What secrets lie buried beneath the Alaskan permafrost? And what kind of price do some people pay for a little gold? Tonight we unearth the horrifying answers. Don't miss a single moment of this descent into the darkest corners of forgotten America. If you want more spine-chilling, true horror content, make sure to subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what we unearth next. Now settle in and prepare yourself. The ghosts of Alaska's past are ready to greet you. I've been inspecting abandoned mines across Alaska for 6 years, and in that time I've seen things that would make most people reconsider their jobs. My name is Jake Morrison, and I'm a mine safety inspector for the state. It's not a glorious profession, but someone has to make sure these old tunnels don't become death traps for curious hikers or local kids seeking adventure. Most of the time it's routine checks, looking for cave-ins, toxic gases, and structural integrity. But what happened at the old Kakot mine changed everything I thought I knew about my work. It was late October 2023 when my supervisor called me with an urgent request. There were reports of strange lights and sounds from the abandoned Kakot copper mine, and the local authorities wanted an official inspection before winter made access impossible. Kennecott is one of Alaska's most famous ghost towns, nestled in the Wrangell Mountains about 5 hours northeast of Anchorage. The mine operated from 1911 to 1938. Producing millions of dollars worth of copper ore before the deposits ran out and the company left, abandoning an entire town that was frozen in time. I had been to Kakot twice before for inspections, always during the day with a full team. This time was different. The reports were coming in between midnight and 3 a.m., so a nighttime investigation was required to properly assess what people were seeing. My supervisor assigned me a partner, a young geologist named Marcus Chen, fresh out of college and eager to prove himself. Looking back, I wish I had gone alone. We arrived at Kennecott just after 11 p.m., driving the final 20 miles on a dirt road that hadn't been maintained since the 1940s. The ghost town sits at the base of massive mountain peaks, and even with a full moon, the shadows cast by those towering ridges made the entire settlement feel like it was drowning in darkness. The main buildings still stand: the huge mill, the general store, the hospital, and rows of worker housing that once sheltered hundreds of miners and their families. During the day, tourists sometimes visit to take pictures and learn about Alaska's mining history. At night, it felt like stepping into a different world entirely. We parked near the mill and began unloading our gear. Standard safety equipment included gas detectors, structural assessment tools, powerful LED floodlights, and emergency communication devices. Marcus was clearly nervous. I could tell by the way he kept double-checking his equipment. He had read the reports about the lights and sounds, and his imagination was getting the better of him. I tried to reassure him that we would probably find nothing more than some loose electrical wiring causing intermittent power issues, or maybe just animals that had made their way into the buildings. The Kakot mine has multiple levels, with the main entrance leading into a network of tunnels that stretch deep into the mountainside. The original mining operation was incredibly advanced for its era, with electric lighting, ventilation systems, and a power plant to keep everything running. When the company abandoned the site, they left most of the infrastructure in place, though decades of Alaska winters had taken their toll. We entered the main shaft at exactly midnight, our headlamps cutting through the absolute darkness. The temperature inside was a constant 38 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to see our breath, but not quite freezing. Our footsteps echoed off the rock walls as we went deeper, following the main corridor toward the areas where the strange activity had been reported. About 300 yards in, we reached the first checkpoint, a large circular chamber with multiple tunnel entrances branching off in different directions, where the original miners would have gathered for shift changes. I was setting up my gas detection equipment when Marcus grabbed my arm. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, over our breathing. I stopped and listened carefully. At first, there was only the typical sounds of an abandoned mine, water dripping in the distance, the occasional groan of settling timber supports, and the whistle of air moving through the ventilation shafts. But then I heard it too, a rhythmic clanging sound, metal on metal, coming from somewhere deeper inside the mine. Probably just thermal expansion, I told Marcus, though I wasn't entirely convinced. Metal contracts and expands with temperature changes. These old support beams have been doing it for decades. But the sound was too regular, too purposeful, to be random thermal movement. It had a pattern to it, like someone hammering or operating machinery. We decided to investigate, following the sound deeper into the mine complex. The clanging led us down a side tunnel I had never explored before. This passage was narrower than the main corridors, with rough-hewn walls that showed the marks of hand tools rather than modern excavation equipment. The original miners must have dug this section manually, probably chasing a particularly rich vein of copper ore. Our headlamps revealed support timbers that looked ancient and potentially unstable, but my structural readings showed they were still solid. As we went deeper, the clanging grew louder and more distinct. It was definitely metallic and definitely rhythmic, but now there was something else underneath it. Human voices speaking in low tones that I couldn't quite make out. Marcus heard them too. He stopped and looked at me with wide eyes. "There's someone else down here," he said, stating the obvious. My first thought was that we had stumbled across trespassers, maybe urban explorers or treasure hunters looking for artifacts to steal. It wouldn't be the first time. But as we got closer, I realized something was wrong. The voices weren't speaking English or any language I could identify. They had an odd, hollow quality to them, like they were coming from very far away, or through some kind of audio distortion. We rounded a bend and found ourselves at the entrance to a large underground chamber. This was clearly one of the original mining areas, with overhead tracks still in place for the ore cars and evidence of extensive excavation work. But what stopped us in our tracks was what we saw inside. There were lights, not electric, but the warm, flickering glow of oil lamps and lanterns. And there were silhouettes, human figures moving around the chamber, carrying tools and equipment, working at what appeared to be an active mining operation. The clanging was coming from their pickaxes and shovels as they worked the rock face, and the voices were the miners calling instructions to each other. I stood there for what felt like several minutes, trying to process it. My rational mind insisted this had to be some kind of elaborate hoax or a historical reenactment we hadn't been told about, but something about the scene felt fundamentally wrong. The lighting was too dim and inconsistent, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The figures themselves appeared translucent, like they were made of smoke or mist rather than solid matter. Marcus was gripping my arm so tightly I could feel his fingers through my heavy jacket. He was trembling. From fear or cold, I couldn't tell. I reached for my radio to contact our supervisor, but when I tried to key the microphone, all I got was static. We were too deep underground for normal radio communication, but my equipment should have been able to reach the repeater we had set up outside. Something was interfering with the signal. One of the figures in the chamber turned toward us, and I saw his face clearly for the first time. He was a man in his 40s with a thick mustache and deep-set eyes that seemed to glow with their own internal light. He was wearing the work clothes miners would have worn in the 1920s, heavy canvas pants, a wool shirt, and a leather cap with a carbide lamp on the front. But the most disturbing thing was that I could see through him. He was there, but he wasn't, like a double-exposed photograph. The miner looked directly at me and smiled, raising his hand in what might have been a greeting or a warning. Then he turned back to his work, driving his pickaxe into the rock face with mechanical precision. The other figures continued their tasks as if we weren't there at all, loading ore into cars, reinforcing tunnel supports, and calling out to each other in that strange, echoing language. I don't know how long we stood there watching this impossible scene. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to move differently in that chamber, like we had stepped outside the normal flow of reality. But eventually, Marcus tugged on my sleeve and pointed toward the tunnel entrance. His meaning was clear. We needed to leave, and we needed to leave now. We backed away as quietly as possible, not wanting to disturb whatever we had witnessed. Once we were around the bend and out of sight, we moved as quickly as we could through the tunnels toward the surface. Neither of us spoke during the retreat. We were both too shaken to put it into words. When we finally emerged, the first light of dawn was beginning to show over the mountain peaks. We had been underground for over 6 hours, though it felt like much less. We packed our gear in silence and drove back toward Anchorage without discussing what had happened. It wasn't until we were back at the office the next day that Marcus finally asked me what I thought we had seen. I told him the truth. I had no idea. Every rational explanation I could think of fell apart. There had been no active mining at Kakot since 1938. No reenactment groups were scheduled to use the site. The figures we had seen were translucent and spoke a language that didn't match any of the ethnic groups who had worked the mine during its operational years. I filed my official report as a routine inspection with no significant findings. I couldn't bring myself to document what we had actually witnessed because I knew no one would believe it. But I haven't been able to stop thinking about that night, and I've done extensive research into the mine's history. What I discovered disturbs me more than the ghostly miners themselves. According to historical records, there were several fatal accidents during the mine's operational years. Cave-ins, gas explosions, and equipment failures claimed the lives of at least 37 workers between 1911 and 1938. Many of these men were buried in unmarked graves near the mine site because their families couldn't afford to transport the bodies home. I believe we witnessed the midnight shift that never ended. Miners who died in those tunnels and continue their work in death as they did in life. They are trapped in that underground world, forever extracting copper ore that no longer exist from rock faces that played out decades ago. I haven't returned to Kakot since that night, and have requested that my supervisor assign the site to other inspectors. Marcus transferred to a different department within 6 months, and now works exclusively on surface-level projects. We've never discussed that night again, but sometimes I catch him looking at me across the office with the same haunted expression I see in my own mirror. The reports of lights and sounds at Kennecott continue to come in, always during the midnight hours, always from people who claim to have seen things that shouldn't exist. I know now that they're telling the truth, and I know that somewhere deep in those mountain tunnels, the midnight shift continues its eternal work. Antique hunting in ghost towns isn't just my hobby. It pays the bills and nourishes my soul in a way few people understand. My name is Isabella Rodriguez, and for the past 8 years I've been traveling across Alaska, searching through abandoned buildings for forgotten treasures that tell the stories of the people who lived and died in this unforgiving wilderness. Most folks think I'm crazy for spending weeks at a time in these desolate places, but there's something magical about finding a piece of history that no one else thought was worth saving. I run a small antique shop in Anchorage called Forgotten, Alaska. My customers range from serious collectors to tourists looking for authentic frontier memorabilia. The real money comes from the rare finds: original mining equipment, native Alaskan artifacts sold with proper documentation, and vintage clothing from the gold rush era. Women's clothing from the early 1900s is particularly valuable because so few pieces survive the harsh conditions and practical needs of frontier life. That's why I was so excited when I heard about the untouched buildings in Dia, a ghost town near Skagway that most people have never even heard of. Dia was a boomtown during the Klondike gold rush of the 1890s, serving as a starting point for prospectors heading over the Chilkoot Pass. At its peak, the town had over 8,000 residents, dozens of businesses, and all the trappings of a thriving frontier community. But when the railroad reached Skagway in 1900, Dia was abandoned almost overnight, leaving behind an entire town frozen in time. I had received a tip that a general store in Dia still contained original merchandise from the 1890s. The building had been locked up tight when the last owner left, and the harsh weather had kept most treasure hunters away. Getting there required a combination of driving and hiking that would take the better part of a day, but the potential payoff was worth the effort. I set out on a clear September morning in 2023, driving the Alaska Highway north toward the Canadian border before turning west toward Skagway. The final approach to Dia required leaving the main road and following an old mining trail that tested the limits of my four-wheel drive truck. The ghost town sits in a valley surrounded by towering peaks, accessible only during the brief summer and fall months when the passes are clear of snow. Dia today consists of scattered building foundations, a few partially standing structures, and the skeletal remains of what was once a bustling pier extending into the Lynn Canal. Most of the original buildings had collapsed decades ago, but I could see the general store my contact had described standing at what would have been the center of town. It was a two-story wooden structure with weathered siding and a peaked roof that had somehow survived more than a century of Alaska winters. The front door was secured with a heavy padlock that had long since rusted solid, but I found a loose board on the back wall that allowed me to squeeze inside. The moment I stepped through that opening, I knew I had found something special. The building still smelled of wood smoke and old leather, and dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight streaming through cracked windows. The main floor had been the retail space, with wooden shelves lining the walls and a long counter running down the center. Most of the merchandise had been cleared out, but I could see remnants of the original inventory: rusted tools, empty bottles, and bolts of fabric that had survived because they were in sealed containers. But it was the second floor that took my breath away. This had been the proprietor's living quarters, and it looked like the family had simply walked away one day, leaving everything behind. There was furniture from the 1890s, personal photographs, books, and clothing still hanging in a wooden armoire. This was exactly the kind of untouched find that antique dealers dream about. I spent the first few hours carefully cataloging what I could see, taking photos, and making notes about the most valuable pieces. There was a dining set that would easily fetch $5,000, several oil paintings that appeared to be original works, and what looked like a complete set of china from a prestigious manufacturer back east. But it was while I was examining the china that I noticed something else. A white garment hanging in the back corner of the armoire, partially hidden behind other clothing. When I carefully moved the other pieces aside, I found myself looking at the most beautiful wedding dress I had ever seen. It was made of ivory silk with intricate beadwork and lace detailing that would have required hundreds of hours of hand-stitching. The style was typical of the 1890s, with a fitted bodice, full skirt, and a train that would have extended several feet behind the bride. But what made this dress truly remarkable was its condition. Despite being over 120 years old, it looked like it had been made yesterday. The silk hadn't yellowed or deteriorated, the beadwork was intact, and there wasn't a single stain or tear anywhere on the garment. I had handled enough vintage clothing to know that this level of preservation was virtually impossible. Silk fabric from that era should have been brittle and discolored after more than a century, especially in Alaska's extreme climate. Yet, this dress looked ready to be worn to a wedding tomorrow. As I lifted the dress to examine it more closely, I noticed something else unusual. Despite its size, it seemed to weigh almost nothing, as if it were made of air rather than fabric. And when I held it up to the window, I could have sworn I saw the dress move slightly, as if there were a gentle breeze in the room, even though all the windows were closed and there was no air circulation. I decided to take the dress back to Anchorage for proper evaluation and potential sale. A wedding dress from the Klondike era in this condition would be worth at least $20,000 to the right collector. I carefully wrapped it in acid-free tissue paper and placed it in a specialized garment box. The drive back to Anchorage was uneventful, but I found myself thinking about the dress the whole time. There was something about finding it that felt different from my other discoveries. Usually, when I find a valuable antique, I feel a sense of satisfaction and excitement about the potential profit. With this dress, I felt something else, an odd sense of responsibility, as if I were being trusted with something precious rather than simply acquiring merchandise for my shop. I arrived home late that evening and carefully transported the box to my workshop, where I had the proper equipment for examining and restoring vintage textiles. I planned to spend the next few days researching its origins and preparing it for sale. But first, I wanted to take some detailed photographs for my records. When I opened the garment box and unwrapped the tissue paper, the dress looked exactly as it had in Dia. Perfect condition, pristine white silk and intricate beadwork that caught the light from my photography lamps. I set up my camera and began taking detailed shots of the bodice, sleeves, and skirt. It was while I was photographing the train that I first saw her. In the viewfinder of my camera, standing behind the dress was a young woman in her early 20s with dark hair styled in the elaborate fashion of the 1890s. She was beautiful, with delicate features and large eyes that seemed to be looking directly at me through the camera lens. But when I lowered the camera to look at the dress directly, there was no one there. I told myself it must have been a trick of the light or a reflection from one of my lamps. But when I raised the camera again, she was still there. This time she appeared to be reaching toward the dress with one hand, as if she were trying to touch it. I set the camera down and stepped back from the dress, my heart racing. I've been around antiques my entire adult life and have heard all the stories about objects carrying the energy or memories of their previous owners. I had always dismissed such tales as superstition, but I couldn't explain what I was seeing through my camera. Over the next several days, the incidents escalated. Every time I tried to work with the dress, I would see the young woman. Sometimes she appeared as a reflection in mirrors or windows. Other times I would catch glimpses of her in my peripheral vision, standing in the corner of my workshop or walking past the doorway. But it wasn't just visual appearances. The dress itself began to behave strangely. I would position it one way for photography and return the next morning to find it arranged differently, as if someone had been handling it overnight. The silk fabric, which should have been cool to the touch, sometimes felt warm when I handled it, as if it had been recently worn. I tried researching the history of the Dia General Store and its owners, hoping to find some explanation. What I discovered made the situation even more disturbing. The store had been owned by a family named Patterson, who arrived in Dia in 1897 during the gold rush. Thomas Patterson ran the store while his wife, Margaret, took care of their daughter, Sarah, who was 19 when they arrived. According to the records I found, Sarah Patterson had been engaged to marry a prospector named William Hayes in the spring of 1899, but the wedding never took place. William Hayes died in an avalanche while attempting to cross Chilkoot Pass in March 1899, just 2 months before the ceremony. Sarah Patterson died of pneumonia that same winter, and her parents abandoned Dia the following summer, unable to bear the memories. The dress I had found was Sarah Patterson's wedding dress, never worn and never removed from the armoire, where it had waited for more than 120 years. As I learned more about Sarah's story, the paranormal activity intensified. I would arrive in the morning to find old photographs scattered around the dress as if someone had been looking through them. My equipment would be moved or turned off, and sometimes I would hear what sounded like quiet sobbing coming from the corner where I kept the dress. The final incident happened 3 weeks after I brought the dress home. I had been working late in my shop, trying to complete the documentation necessary to sell it to a collector in Seattle. It was nearly midnight when I heard music coming from my workshop. Soft, melodic music that sounded like a music box or a player piano. When I went to investigate, I found the dress floating 3 feet off the ground, swaying gently as if someone were wearing it and dancing to the distant music. The young woman I had seen in my photographs was now fully visible, translucent but clearly present, wearing the dress and moving in a waltz pattern. She saw me watching and stopped dancing, turning to face me with an expression of infinite sadness. When she spoke, her voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. "I never got to wear it," she said. "I never got to dance at my wedding." I stood there frozen, unable to move or speak. As Sarah Patterson continued to dance, she gradually faded away, and the dress settled gently onto my workbench. The next morning, I carefully packed the wedding dress and drove it back to Dia. I returned it to the armoire where I had found it, arranging it exactly as it had been. As I was leaving, I could swear I heard a woman's voice carried on the wind saying, Thank you. I never went back to that building, and I've never told anyone else about what I experienced. Some objects are not meant to be bought and sold. Some treasures are meant to remain where they are, keeping their secrets and their sorrows in the places where they belong. The dress is still there in Dia, waiting in the armoire of an abandoned general store, as beautiful and perfect as the day it was made. And sometimes on quiet nights when the wind is just right, locals say you can hear waltz music drifting through the ruins of the old town, as if someone is finally having the wedding dance that never was. Growing up, my grandfather used to tell me stories about the old railroad days, back when the Alaska Railroad was the lifeline connecting remote communities to the rest of the world. He worked as a conductor for 37 years, riding those rails through some of the most beautiful and dangerous terrain on Earth. My name is Marcus Washington, and I'm 24 years old. Unlike my grandfather, I never worked for the railroad professionally, but trains have been my passion since childhood. I collect vintage railroad memorabilia, study historical routes, and spend my weekends exploring abandoned rail lines across Alaska. That passion is what brought me to McCarthy in October 2023. McCarthy is a tiny community that sits at the end of one of the most remote railroad spurs ever built in Alaska. The Copper River and Northwestern Railway constructed the line in the early 1910s to transport copper ore from the Cacot mines to the port in Cordova. When the mines closed in 1938, the railroad was abandoned, leaving behind nearly 200 miles of track, bridges, and tunnels that slowly disappeared back into the wilderness. Most of the original rail line has been reclaimed by nature or dismantled for scrap metal, but some sections near McCarthy still show evidence of the engineering marvel that once carried millions of tons of ore through seemingly impossible mountain terrain. I had been planning this trip for months, hoping to photograph the remaining trestles and document what was left before winter made access impossible. I arrived in McCarthy on a gray Thursday afternoon, driving the notoriously difficult McCarthy Road that roughly follows the same route the railroad once took. The road is 60 miles of potholes, washouts, and single-lane bridges that test both your vehicle and your nerve. McCarthy itself has maybe 25 year-round residents, most of whom make their living from the handful of tourists who visit during the summer months. I had arranged to stay at a small bed and breakfast run by an elderly woman named Rose Delano, whose family had lived in the area since the railroad days. Rose was in her 70s with silver hair and the kind of weathered hands that come from decades of Alaska living. She seemed pleased to have a guest interested in local railroad history. Over dinner that first night, she shared stories about the old days when the train would arrive twice a week carrying supplies, mail, and passengers. My father worked for the railroad, she told me as we sat in her kitchen drinking coffee. He was a section foreman responsible for maintaining about 10 miles of track through some of the worst country you can imagine. He used to say that railroad was built more on determination than engineering sense. Rose warned me about exploring the old rail line alone, especially during the short October days when darkness came early and weather could change without warning. But she also understood the fascination with railroad history and agreed to let me borrow an old trail map that showed where the most accessible sections of track remained. The next morning, I set out with my camera, hiking boots, and enough supplies for a full day of exploration. The section I planned to document was about 3 miles from town, where the railroad had crossed a deep gorge on a timber trestle bridge. According to my research, portions of that bridge were still standing, though the rails themselves had been removed decades ago. The hike to the bridge site took me through dense forest and over rough terrain that showed no signs of recent human passage. The original roadbed was still visible in places, marked by the distinctive grading and drainage ditches that railroad crews had carved through the wilderness more than a century ago. As I walked, I tried to imagine what it must have been like for those early workers building a railroad through country that seemed determined to reject human intrusion. I reached the gorge around noon and found the remains of the trestle bridge exactly where my map indicated. It was an impressive sight. Even in its deteriorated condition, the original structure had been built from massive timber beams, some 3 feet thick, arranged in the complex geometric patterns typical of early 20th century railroad engineering. About half of the bridge was still standing, though it was clearly unsafe for crossing. The missing sections had fallen into the gorge below, where I could see the twisted remains of wooden beams and iron hardware scattered among the rocks. I spent several hours photographing the bridge from different angles, documenting the construction techniques and hardware that would have been state-of-the-art when the line was built. The afternoon was quiet except for the sound of wind through the trees and the distant call of ravens. It was exactly the kind of peaceful, isolated experience I had been hoping for. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, I started packing up my equipment for the hike back to town. The October days were short, and I wanted to be off the trail before full darkness set in. That was when I heard it for the first time, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to be coming from somewhere deep in the forest. At first, I thought it might be a helicopter or small aircraft, but the sound was wrong for that. It was more mechanical, more regular, like the steady chuffing of a steam engine working hard to pull a heavy load up a steep grade. I stopped packing and listened more carefully. The sound grew louder and more distinct, and I realized with a chill that it was coming from the direction of the abandoned railroad line, specifically from the tracks themselves, as if a train were approaching the bridge where I stood. I told myself it had to be some kind of industrial equipment, maybe a maintenance crew working on the road system or a mining operation I hadn't heard about. But as the sound continued to grow louder, I began to make out other noises underneath the main engine sound. The rhythmic clicking of wheels on rails, the squeal of metal brake shoes, and what sounded like the sharp blast of a steam whistle echoing off the mountain walls. The rational part of my mind insisted this was impossible. There had been no active railroad traffic here since 1938. The rails had been removed, the bridges were unsafe, and there was no conceivable reason for any kind of train to be operating on this abandoned line. But my ears were telling me a different story. I grabbed my camera and positioned myself where I would have a clear view of the bridge approach, thinking that whatever was making the sound would have to come into sight soon. The mechanical noises were now loud enough that I could distinguish individual components: the heavy breathing of a steam locomotive, the clatter of multiple cars following behind the engine, and voices calling out what sounded like work commands. That was when I saw the headlight. A single bright beam cut through the forest darkness, moving along the exact path where the railroad tracks had once been. Behind the light, I could make out the dark bulk of a steam locomotive, its smokestack visible against the evening sky. The engine was pulling what appeared to be a long train of freight cars, all of them loaded with what looked like copper ore from the Kakot mines. I raised my camera and started taking pictures, though my hands were shaking so badly I wasn't sure any of them would be in focus. Through the viewfinder, I could see details that should not have been possible. The locomotive was a narrow-gauge engine typical of the early 1900s, painted in the dark green livery of the Copper River and Northwestern Railway. I could see figures in the cab, men wearing the work clothes that railroad crews would have worn during the line's original operation. The train approached the broken bridge at what seemed like normal operating speed, showing no signs of slowing down or stopping. I wanted to shout a warning, to alert the crew that the bridge was unsafe, but no sound would come from my throat. I could only stand there and watch as the locomotive reached the edge of the intact portion of the trestle. What happened next defied every law of physics I understood. Instead of plunging into the gorge, the train continued across empty air, following the path where the missing rails should have been. I could see it clearly. A full locomotive and string of ore cars crossing a gap of more than 100 feet, supported by nothing but thin mountain air. The phantom train completed its impossible crossing and disappeared into the forest on the other side, the sound of its engine gradually fading into the distance. Within minutes, the mechanical noises were gone entirely, leaving only the natural sounds of wind and wildlife. I stood at the edge of the broken bridge for a long time, staring across the gorge and trying to process what I had witnessed. When I finally looked at my camera to review the photographs, every single image showed nothing but empty forest and the broken remains of the trestle. Whatever I had seen and heard had left no trace on the digital sensor. The hike back to McCarthy, in the gathering darkness, was the longest 3 miles of my life. Every sound in the forest made me jump, and I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the headlight of the phantom train bearing down on me. By the time I reached Rose's bed and breakfast, my nerves were completely shattered. Rose took one look at me and immediately made a pot of strong coffee, settling me down at her kitchen table while I tried to explain what had happened. She listened, without interruption, nodding occasionally but showing no signs of surprise or disbelief. When I finished, Rose was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. Finally, she looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're not the first person to see that train," she said quietly. "My father saw it 3 times during his years working the section, always in the evening, always crossing that same bridge. He used to say it was the spirits of the men who died building the railroad, still trying to complete their run to Cordova." She went to an old wooden cabinet and pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1923. The headline read, "Train Derailment Claims 6 Lives Near McCarthy." According to the article, a locomotive and 4 ore cars had plunged off the trestle during a winter storm, killing the entire crew. Their bodies were never recovered from the bottom of the gorge. "Every few years someone sees them," Rose continued. "Always the same train, always crossing the broken bridge, always heading toward Cordova with a load of copper ore. My father used to say they'll keep making that run until someone fixes the bridge and lets them complete their journey." I left McCarthy the next morning, cutting my planned week-long visit short. I haven't been back since, and I have no plans to return. Sometimes late at night, when I hear the distant whistle of a modern freight train, I think about those phantom railroad men forever trapped on their endless run through the Alaska wilderness. The photographs I took that day show nothing unusual, just the broken remains of an old trestle bridge in a remote mountain gorge. But I know what I saw and what I heard. Somewhere in the forests around McCarthy, the last train is still running, carrying its ghostly crew and phantom cargo on a journey that will never end. As a substitute teacher, I've worked in some pretty remote places across Alaska, but nothing prepared me for what I experienced in the abandoned schoolhouse at Chitina. My name is Emma Thompson, and I'm 26 years old. For the past 4 years, I've been traveling between small communities throughout the state, filling in wherever certified teachers are needed. The work is challenging but rewarding, especially when you get to see children in isolated areas receive the education they deserve. Most of the communities I visit are still active with functioning schools and eager students, but occasionally I encounter places where the schools have been abandoned for decades, victims of economic decline or population shifts that left entire towns empty. Chitina falls into this category. Once a thriving railroad town with over 1,000 residents, it now has fewer than 50 year-round inhabitants, most of whom are elderly or running tourism-related businesses during the brief summer season. I came to Chitina in late September 2023, not to teach but to research a paper I was writing about rural education in Alaska for my master's degree program. The town's old schoolhouse, built in 1915, was supposed to be an excellent example of early 20th century frontier architecture, adapted for educational purposes. I had received permission from the town council to photograph and document the building, with the understanding that I would share my research with the local historical society. The schoolhouse sits on a small hill overlooking what remains of Chitina's main street. It's a 2-story wooden structure with tall windows designed to maximize natural light during Alaska's dark winter months. The building served the community from 1915 until 1987, when declining enrollment forced the consolidation of classes with a school in nearby Glen Allen. Since then, it had been locked up and largely forgotten, slowly deteriorating in the harsh climate. I arrived on a gray afternoon that threatened rain. Driving the 70-mile gravel road from the Richardson Highway, the town felt almost deserted, with most of the buildings showing signs of abandonment or minimal maintenance. The few residents I encountered were friendly, but seemed surprised that anyone would be interested in the old schoolhouse. The building's caretaker was a man named Robert Steinberg, who had been a student there in the 1960s and later served on the school board when it closed. He was in his 70s with thick gray hair and the kind of calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of manual labor. Robert seemed genuinely pleased that someone wanted to document the school's history, and he spent nearly an hour telling me stories about teachers and students from decades past. "That place has a lot of memories," he said as he handed me the keys. Some good, some not so good. The winters were hard on everyone, especially the children who had to walk miles to get to school. We lost a few students over the years to accidents and illness, but the school kept going until there just weren't enough kids left to justify keeping it open. Robert warned me that the electrical system had been disconnected years ago, so I would need to bring my own lighting. He also mentioned that some of the floorboards on the second floor were potentially unsafe, advising me to stay on the main floor if possible. With those cautions in mind, I thanked him and headed up the hill. The front door of the schoolhouse opened with a loud creak that echoed through the empty building. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the musty smell of old wood and paper that had been sitting undisturbed for decades. The main floor consisted of 2 large classrooms, a small office that had served as the principal's workspace, and a narrow hallway that connected to the staircase leading to the second floor. Both classrooms retained much of their original equipment. Wooden desks arranged in rows, a large blackboard at the front of each room, and educational posters that had faded with age, but were still partially readable. In one classroom, I found a globe that must have dated to the 1950s, showing countries and borders that no longer existed. The other room had a piano in the corner, its keys yellowed with age and several strings broken. I spent the first few hours taking photographs and making detailed notes. The building was a remarkable time capsule, preserving not just the physical structure but also the atmosphere of a frontier school where children had learned to read and write in one of America's most challenging environments. As the afternoon wore on, I decided to explore the second floor. Despite Robert's warnings, I tested each step carefully as I climbed the narrow staircase and found that while some boards were soft, the structure seemed fundamentally sound. The second floor had originally been designed as an auditorium and assembly space, with a small stage at one end and rows of wooden benches. It was while I was photographing the stage that I first heard the school bell. The sound was unmistakable, the deep bronze tone of a large school bell ringing in the measured pattern that would have called students to class or dismissed them for recess. But according to Robert, the bell had been removed years ago and donated to a museum. I looked around for any obvious source, but the bell tower was clearly empty. I told myself it must have been some kind of acoustic phenomenon, maybe wind blowing through the tower in a way that created sound. But as I continued working, the bell rang again, this time in a different pattern. 3 short rings followed by 2 long ones, the traditional signal for the end of the school day. The third time I heard the bell, it was accompanied by other sounds. The scraping of chairs against wooden floors, the rustle of papers, and what sounded like children's voices talking excitedly as they prepared to leave for the day. The sounds were coming from the main floor classrooms directly below me. I went down the staircase as quietly as possible. When I reached the hallway, I could hear the sounds more clearly. Children were definitely talking, their voices high and animated. I could make out individual words occasionally. Homework, recess, and Miss Anderson. I approached the first classroom and peered around the doorframe. What I saw made no rational sense. The classroom was full of children, perhaps 20 or 25, ranging in age from about 6 to 14. They were dressed in clothing from the 1940s or 50s, simple dresses for the girls, knickers, and suspenders for the boys. At the front of the room stood a woman in her 30s wearing a long skirt and white blouse. Her dark hair was pinned back in a style that matched the period. She was writing something on the blackboard, and her handwriting was the kind of careful script that teachers of that era would have drilled into their students. The children appeared solid and real, not translucent or ghostly, gathering there, books and papers, putting on coats and hats and chatting. But something was subtly wrong. It took me a few minutes to realize the children cast no shadows. Despite the bright afternoon light streaming through the windows, none of the figures created the dark silhouettes that living people would. They were there, but they were not entirely there. The teacher at the front of the room looked up from the blackboard and made eye contact with me. She had kind eyes and a gentle smile. When she spoke, her voice had the clear, carrying quality of a good teacher. "Class is dismissed for today," she said, though she continued looking directly at me rather than at her students. "Please remember to finish your arithmetic problems for tomorrow and bundle up warm for the walk home. Winter is coming early this year." The children began filing out, passing within inches of where I stood. As they walked by, I could feel a slight chill, as if each child were surrounded by a pocket of cold that moved with them. One little girl, perhaps 8 years old with blonde braids and a red wool coat, stopped directly in front of me and tugged on my jacket sleeve. When I looked down, she smiled and spoke in a voice that sounded like it was coming from very far away. "Are you our new teacher?" she asked. "Miss Anderson has been waiting for someone to help her with the upper grades. There are so many of us now and we all want to learn." Before I could respond, the child continued walking, joining the stream of students leaving the building. I followed them outside, watching as they scattered in different directions down the hill. The teacher, Miss Anderson, was the last to leave. She paused beside me on the front steps and looked out over the nearly empty town. "We have been waiting so long for the school to reopen," she said quietly. "The children miss their lessons, terribly. They keep coming back, hoping that someday there will be teachers and books and proper classes again." She turned to face me directly, and her eyes held a deep sadness mixed with hope. "Will you stay and teach them?" she asked. "They have been without proper instruction for so many years. They deserve to finish their education before." She paused, and the sadness deepened. "Before the accident." I wanted to ask what accident she was referring to, but before I could, she smiled one more time and walked down the hill. As a substitute teacher, I've worked in some pretty remote places across Alaska, but nothing prepared me for what I experienced in the abandoned schoolhouse at Chitina. My name is Emma Thompson, and I'm 26 years old. For the past 4 years, I've been traveling between small communities throughout the state, filling in wherever certified teachers are needed. The work is challenging but rewarding, especially when you get to see children in isolated areas receive the education they deserve. Most of the communities I visit are still active with functioning schools and eager students, but occasionally I encounter places where the schools have been abandoned for decades, victims of economic decline or population shifts that left entire towns empty. Chitina falls into this category. Once a thriving railroad town with over 1,000 residents, it now has fewer than 50 year-round inhabitants, most of whom are elderly or running tourism-related businesses during the brief summer season. I came to Chitina in late September 2023, not to teach but to research a paper I was writing about rural education in Alaska for my master's degree program. The town's old schoolhouse, built in 1915, was supposed to be an excellent example of early 20th century frontier architecture, adapted for educational purposes. I had received permission from the town council to photograph and document the building, with the understanding that I would share my research with the local historical society. The schoolhouse sits on a small hill overlooking what remains of Chitina's main street. It's a 2-story wooden structure with tall windows designed to maximize natural light during Alaska's dark winter months. The building served the community from 1915 until 1987, when declining enrollment forced the consolidation of classes with a school in nearby Glen Ellen. Since then, it had been locked up and largely forgotten, slowly deteriorating in the harsh climate. I arrived on a gray afternoon that threatened rain. Driving the 70-mile gravel road from the Richardson Highway, the town felt almost deserted, with most of the buildings showing signs of abandonment or minimal maintenance. The few residents I encountered were friendly, but seemed surprised that anyone would be interested in the old schoolhouse. The building's caretaker was a man named Robert Steinberg, who had been a student there in the 1960s and later served on the school board when it closed. He was in his 70s with thick gray hair and the kind of calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of manual labor. Robert seemed genuinely pleased that someone wanted to document the school's history, and he spent nearly an hour telling me stories about teachers and students from decades past. "That place has a lot of memories," he said as he handed me the keys. "Some good, some not so good. The winters were hard on everyone, especially the children who had to walk miles to get to school. We lost a few students over the years to accidents and illness, but the school kept going until there just weren't enough kids left to justify keeping it open." Robert warned me that the electrical system had been disconnected years ago, so I would need to bring my own lighting. He also mentioned that some of the floorboards on the second floor were potentially unsafe, advising me to stay on the main, floor if possible. With those cautions in mind, I thanked him and headed up the hill. The front door of the schoolhouse opened with a loud creak that echoed through the empty building. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the musty smell of old wood and paper that had been sitting undisturbed for decades. The main floor consisted of 2 large classrooms, a small office that had served as the principal's workspace, and a narrow hallway that connected to the staircase leading to the 2nd floor. Both classrooms retained much of their original equipment. Wooden desks arranged in rows, a large blackboard at the front of each room, and educational posters that had faded with age, but were still partially readable. In one classroom, I found a globe that must have dated to the 1950s, showing countries and borders that no longer existed. The other room had a piano in the corner, its keys yellowed with age and several strings broken. I spent the first few hours taking photographs and making detailed notes. The building was a remarkable time capsule, preserving not just the physical structure but also the atmosphere of a frontier school where children had learned to read and write in one of America's most challenging environments. As the afternoon wore on, I decided to explore the 2nd floor. Despite Robert's warnings, I tested each step carefully as I climbed the narrow staircase and found that while some boards were soft, the structure seemed fundamentally sound. The 2nd floor had originally been designed as an auditorium and assembly space, with a small stage at one end and rows of wooden benches. It was while I was photographing the stage that I first heard the school bell. The sound was unmistakable, the deep bronze tone of a large school bell ringing in the measured pattern that would have called students to class or dismissed them for recess. But according to Robert, the bell had been removed years ago and donated to a museum. I looked around for any obvious source, but the bell tower was clearly empty. I told myself it must have been some kind of acoustic phenomenon, maybe wind blowing through the tower in a way that created sound. But as I continued working, the bell rang again, this time in a different pattern. 3 short rings followed by 2 long ones, the traditional signal for the end of the school day. The 3rd time I heard the bell, it was accompanied by other sounds. The scraping of chairs against wooden floors, the rustle of papers, and what sounded like children's voices talking excitedly as they prepared to leave for the day. The sounds were coming from the main floor classrooms directly below me. I went down the staircase as quietly as possible. When I reached the hallway, I could hear the sounds more clearly. Children were definitely talking, their voices high and animated. I could make out individual words occasionally. Homework, recess, and Miss Anderson. I approached the first classroom and peered around the doorframe. What I saw made no rational sense. The classroom was full of children, perhaps 20 or 25, ranging in age from about 6 to 14. They were dressed in clothing from the 1940s or 50s, simple dresses for the girls, knickers, and suspenders for the boys. At the front of the room stood a woman in her 30s wearing a long skirt and white blouse. Her dark hair was pinned back in a style that matched the period. She was writing something on the blackboard, and her handwriting was the kind of careful script that teachers of that era would have drilled into their students. The children appeared solid and real, not translucent or ghostly, gathering there, books and papers, putting on coats and hats and chatting. But something was subtly wrong. It took me a few minutes to realize the children cast no shadows. Despite the bright afternoon light streaming through the windows, none of the figures created the dark silhouettes that living people would. They were there, but they were not entirely there. The teacher at the front of the room looked up from the blackboard and made eye contact with me. She had kind eyes and a gentle smile. When she spoke, her voice had the clear, carrying quality of a good teacher. "Class is dismissed for today," she said, though she continued looking directly at me rather than at her students. "Please remember to finish your arithmetic problems for tomorrow and bundle up warm for the walk home. Winter is coming early this year." The children began filing out, passing within inches of where I stood. As they walked by, I could feel a slight chill, as if each child were surrounded by a pocket of cold that moved with them. One little girl, perhaps 8 years old with blonde braids and a red wool coat, stopped directly in front of me and tugged on my jacket sleeve. When I looked down, she smiled and spoke in a voice that sounded like it was coming from very far away. "Are you our new teacher?" she asked. "Miss Anderson has been waiting for someone to help her with the upper grades." There are so many of us now and we all want to learn. Before I could respond, the child continued walking, joining the stream of students leaving the building. I followed them outside, watching as they scattered in different directions down the hill. The teacher, Miss Anderson, was the last to leave. She paused beside me on the front steps and looked out over the nearly empty town. "We have been waiting so long for the school to reopen," she said quietly. "The children miss their lessons, terribly. They keep coming back hoping that someday there will be teachers and books and proper classes again." She turned to face me directly, and her eyes held a deep sadness mixed with hope. "Will you stay and teach them?" she asked. "They have been without proper instruction for so many years. They deserve to finish their education before." She paused, and the sadness deepened. "Before the accident." I wanted to ask what accident she was referring to, but before I could, she smiled one more time and walked down the hill. When I returned the keys to Robert Steinberg that evening, I asked him about Miss Anderson and whether there had been any accidents. His expression grew somber, and he invited me inside for coffee. "Margaret Anderson taught here from 1952 to 1967, he told me, settling into an old recliner. "She was one of the best teachers we ever had. She really cared about the kids." He paused to sip his coffee. "The accident happened in February 1967. There was a terrible blizzard, the worst storm anyone could remember. School should have been canceled, but the weather report had been wrong and it caught everyone by surprise. Miss Anderson kept all the children inside, but the building's heating system failed during the night." He was quiet for a long moment. "They found them the next morning when the storm cleared, all of them together in the main classroom where Miss Anderson had gathered them around the piano. Carbon monoxide from a faulty chimney. 23 children and their teacher, all of them gone. I spent one more night in Chitina, but I did not return to the schoolhouse. The next morning, as I was loading my car for the drive back to Anchorage, I heard the school bell ringing across the empty town. 3 short rings followed by 2 long ones calling students to another day of learning that would never end. My job takes me to the most isolated communities in Alaska, places where getting supplies can mean the difference between life and death during the long winter months. My name is Ryan Alley, and I'm 35 years old. For the past 8 years, I've worked as a supply chain manager for Northern Logistics, a company that specializes in delivering goods to remote villages, mining operations, and research stations. It's demanding work that requires careful planning and an understanding of how quickly weather can turn a routine delivery into a survival situation. Most of my routes involve active communities with real people who depend on our deliveries for everything from food and medicine to fuel and equipment parts. But occasionally, I get requests for deliveries to locations that exist more on paper than in reality. Places where someone still maintains a mailing address, even though the community itself has been abandoned for decades. That was the case with LMR, a ghost town on Prince William Sound that had been a copper mining community from 1897 to 1919. According to my delivery manifest, someone at Elmar had ordered a substantial shipment of basic supplies, canned goods, batteries, medical, supplies, and other items essential for surviving an Alaska winter. The order was paid for in advance with a cashier's check that cleared without any problems. But when I tried to contact the customer, the number was disconnected. Company policy required me to attempt delivery even without customer contact. So, I loaded my supply truck and headed for the coordinates on the manifest. The drive to LMR required taking the Seward Highway south from Anchorage, then following a series of increasingly remote roads toward the coast. The final approach was a narrow gravel track that hadn't seen maintenance in years, winding through dense forest before emerging at the shore of Prince William Sound. Elmar sits on a natural harbor that had been ideal for shipping copper ore. During its peak years, the town supported nearly 800 residents with all the necessary infrastructure: houses, businesses, a school, and most importantly for my purposes, a company store that had served as the commercial center. When I arrived, in late October 2023, LMR consisted of scattered building foundations, a few partially standing structures, and the skeletal remains of mining equipment. Most of the original buildings had collapsed or been dismantled, but I could see one structure in relatively good condition, a two-story wooden building with weathered siding and a hand-painted sign that read, Elmar Company Store. According to the shipping address, this was my destination. The building looked abandoned, but my instructions were clear, and I'd learned not to question the eccentricities of people who live in remote Alaska. I parked my truck and began unloading boxes onto a hand truck. The front door was closed but not locked, opening with a loud creak. Inside, I found myself in a perfectly preserved general store from the early 1900s, complete with wooden shelves, glass display cases, and an old-fashioned cash register. The store still contained merchandise, though everything was covered with decades of dust. There were bolts of fabric, hand tools, canned goods with labels I didn't recognize, and various household items. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of old wood and paper, and dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight. I began stacking the supply boxes near the front counter, planning to leave them with a delivery note since no one was present to sign for the shipment. That was when I heard footsteps from the back, followed by a voice calling out, "Just a moment, I'll be right with you." A man emerged from what appeared to be a storage area. He was perhaps 50, with graying hair and a thick mustache, typical of men from the early 20th century. He wore a white shirt with sleeve garters, dark pants held up by suspenders, and a leather apron, suggesting he was the proprietor. What struck me most was how clean and well-dressed he looked, as if he had just started his workday. "You must be from Northern Logistics," he said with a warm smile. "I've been expecting this delivery for quite some time. I hope you didn't have any trouble finding us." I was confused by his comment since the order had only been placed 2 weeks earlier, but I assumed he was referring to the challenges of getting supplies to such a remote location. I handed him the manifest, and he reviewed the list. "This looks perfect," he said. "My customers have been asking for these items, and I was starting to worry that I wouldn't be able to fulfill their orders before winter sets in." I looked around the empty store and wondered what customers he was referring to. But it wasn't my job to question how people ran their businesses. I helped him carry the boxes behind the counter, and he carefully arranged them with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been running a general store for many years. When we finished, he reached into a cash drawer and counted out payment in cash. The bills were crisp and new, despite being of a design that hadn't been used for decades. I had seen enough old currency to recognize that these were genuine bills, from the 1940s and 50s, though they looked like they had been printed yesterday. "I appreciate you making the trip out here," he said, shaking my hand with a grip that felt surprisingly cold. "I know it's not easy to reach Lamar, especially this late in the season. My customers will be very pleased to see that I've restocked the shelves." As if summoned by his words, I heard the front door open, followed by the sound of multiple people entering. I turned to see a group of men and women dressed in work clothes from the early 1900s, carrying shopping baskets and talking among themselves. They appeared to be miners and their families. The customers moved through the store with familiarity, selecting items and discussing prices with the storekeeper. They seemed solid and real, but there was something about their presence that made the air feel thick and charged. One woman approached the counter carrying canned goods and fabric. "Put this on the Murphy account," she said. "John will settle. Up on payday, like always." Her voice had an odd, echoing quality. The storekeeper nodded and made notations in a leather-bound ledger. As he worked, more customers continued to enter, creating a bustling atmosphere. I watched this impossible scene for several minutes, trying to understand what I was witnessing. My logical mind insisted this was an elaborate historical reenactment, but the customers were too numerous and too detailed for any amateur production. They moved and spoke with the natural ease of people going about their daily business, not performers following a script. The storekeeper finished serving his customers and walked back to me. "Thank you again for the delivery," he said, shaking my hand. "I'll be placing another order in a few weeks once I see how quickly these items sell. Business has been very good lately." I left the LMR company store in a state of confusion and disbelief, driving back to Anchorage while trying to make sense of what I had experienced. The cash payment was real enough, sitting in my jacket pocket, but everything else defied rational explanation. When I returned to the office, I submitted a successful delivery report, though I didn't mention the unusual circumstances. I also deposited the cash, which the bank accepted without question, despite the age of the bills. 2 weeks later, I received another order for LMR, paid for with a cashier's check. This time I made the delivery with a different driver, claiming I had other routes to handle. According to his report, the delivery went smoothly, though he did mention that the customer seemed unusually old-fashioned in his dress and manner of speaking. I haven't returned to Elmar since that October day, and I've requested that other drivers handle any future deliveries to that location. But I still think about the company store and wonder whether it continues to serve customers who have been shopping there for more than a century, conducting business transactions that somehow span the gap between the living world and whatever exists beyond it. I specialize in photographing abandoned places across the last frontier, documenting the remnants of Alaska's boom and bust cycles before they disappear entirely into the wilderness. My name is Zoe Kim, and I'm 29 years old. For the past 6 years, I've been working as a documentary photographer, focusing on historical sites that tell the story of human ambition and failure in one of the world's most unforgiving environments. My work has been featured in a number of publications and museum exhibitions. Photography in abandoned locations requires more than just technical skill. You need to understand the history of the places you visit, respect the memories embedded in decaying structures, and develop an intuition for finding the shots that capture not just what remains, but what has been lost. Some photographers hunt for dramatic lighting or unusual angles, but I've always been drawn to the subtler images that reveal the human stories behind abandoned places. That philosophy brought me to Liouch Island in September 2023, a remote location in Prince William Sound that had been the site of Alaska's largest copper mining operation during the early 1900s. At its peak, Liouch supported nearly 1,500 residents and produced millions of pounds of high-grade copper ore. When the copper deposits were exhausted in the 1930s, the entire community was abandoned almost overnight, leaving behind one of Alaska's most complete ghost towns. Accessing Latouche required chartering a small boat from Whittier, a 2-hour journey across often rough waters. I had arranged for the boat captain to drop me off in the morning and return the following evening, giving me nearly 36 hours to explore and photograph. It was an expensive proposition, but the isolation meant that very few photographers had documented Liouch in recent years, and I was hoping to capture images that would complete a book project I was working on. The boat dropped me off at the ruins of what had once been a substantial pier. The harbor was eerily quiet, except for the sound of waves and the occasional cry of seabirds. Behind the ruined pier, I could see the remains of the town spread across, a natural amphitheater. Most of the original buildings had collapsed, but enough structures remained to give a sense of what the community had been like. There were the foundations of dozens of houses, the skeletal frame of the company store, and, most impressively, the massive ruins of the copper processing mill. I spent the first few hours exploring and planning my shots. The late September light was perfect for the kind of atmospheric shots I wanted, with low-angled sunlight filtering through the ruins and creating dramatic shadows. I was particularly interested in photographing the mill ruins, which rose from the hillside like the skeleton of some enormous industrial beast. The mill had been built in stages, resulting in a complex structure of steel girders, concrete foundations, and massive machinery. Walking through the ruins was like exploring a three-dimensional puzzle. I was setting up for a shot of the mill's main processing floor when I first noticed something unusual in my camera's viewfinder. Through the lens, I could see what appeared to be a human figure standing among the machinery, partially obscured by shadows and twisted metal. When I lowered the camera to look directly, there was no one there. I assumed it was a trick of the light. But when I raised the camera again, the figure was still visible, and this time I could see more details. It appeared to be a man wearing work clothes typical of the early 1900s. I took several photographs thinking it might create an interesting artistic effect. But each time I looked through the viewfinder, I could see the worker clearly, while direct observation revealed only empty ruins. As I continued photographing, I began seeing more figures through my camera lens. They appeared to be miners and mill workers going about their daily tasks, operating equipment, carrying tools, and moving with the purposeful efficiency of people who knew their jobs well. Some were more distinct than others, but all of them shared the same translucent quality that made them visible only through the camera. By late afternoon, I had documented at least 20 different figures working throughout the mill. What struck me most was how natural and unstaged their movements appeared. They weren't performing for my camera. They were simply continuing the work they had done in life, unaware that the mill had been abandoned for nearly 90 years. The most compelling figure was a woman in her 30s wearing a long skirt and white blouse, suggesting she worked in an office. Through my camera, I could see her moving between different areas of the mill, carrying what looked like paperwork and occasionally stopping to speak with the other workers. She had an air of authority that suggested she might have been a supervisor or administrator. When I focused my telephoto lens on her face, she looked directly into the camera with an expression of mild curiosity. Her eyes held an intelligence and warmth that made her seem completely real and human, despite being invisible to my naked eye. I spent nearly an hour photographing this woman, documenting what appeared to be a typical workday in the Liuch mill, circa 1920. She seemed to be conducting some kind of inspection, examining equipment and taking notes in a leather-bound ledger. At one point, she came very close to where I was standing and appeared to look directly at me. When she spoke, I couldn't hear her voice, but I could read her lips clearly as she mouthed the words, "Are you documenting our work?" I nodded instinctively. She seemed to understand and smiled, gesturing for me to follow her. She led me to what had been the administrative offices, a section of the mill where wooden structures had been built within the larger steel framework. Through my camera, I could see that this area was fully furnished and operational, with desks, filing cabinets, and office equipment. Several people were working, processing paperwork. The woman pointed to a large chart on the wall that showed production figures and shipping schedules. Through my telephoto lens, I could read the dates clearly. They were all from 1927, the peak year of production. She seemed to want me to understand that I was witnessing the mill during its most successful period. As the sun began to set, the phantom workers gradually became more difficult to see, even through my camera lens. They grew fainter and more translucent until they were little more than suggestions of movement. By full dark, they had disappeared entirely, leaving me alone. I spent the night camped near the harbor, and the next morning I continued photographing other areas, but the phantom workers had vanished with the daylight, and my camera showed only empty buildings and rusted equipment. When I returned to Anchorage and developed the digital images, I expected that the figures wouldn't appear. But, to my amazement, they were all there. Dozens of ghostly workers captured in various poses and activities. The images were subtle and could easily be dismissed as photographic artifacts, but I knew what I had witnessed. The most remarkable photograph was the one of the administrative offices. In the final image, I could see the woman sitting at her desk, and more importantly, I could see the production chart on the wall behind her with all the dates and figures clearly readable. When I researched the historical records, I found that the production figures shown in my photograph matched exactly with the documented output for 1927. There was no way I could have known these specific numbers before taking the pictures. I've included several of the Latouche photographs in museum exhibitions, though I never mention the supernatural circumstances. Viewers sometimes comment on the atmospheric quality or ask about my digital manipulation techniques, not realizing they are looking at genuine documentary photographs of people who died nearly a century ago. The experience changed my approach to photographing abandoned places. I now understand that my camera can capture more than just physical ruins. It can document the memories and energies that linger. Some locations retain the imprints of the people who lived and worked there, and under the right circumstances, those imprints can be photographed and preserved. I've returned to Liuch twice, but I've never again seen the phantom workers. Perhaps they only appear to photographers who approach their former workplace with the right combination of respect and curiosity. Or perhaps that single day in September 2023 was a unique moment when the barriers between past and present became temporarily transparent. The photographs remain as proof of what I witnessed, tangible evidence that some places never truly become abandoned as long as the memories continue to echo through their empty spaces. Someone has to look after these forgotten places to ensure that history doesn't simply vanish into the wilderness. My name is Samuel Blackwood, and I'm 42 years old. For the past 15 years, I've worked as a historical preservationist for the Alaska Heritage Foundation, maintaining and protecting abandoned settlements. It's solitary work that requires spending weeks or months alone in remote locations, but I've never minded the isolation. These ghost towns have stories to tell, and I consider myself their guardian and interpreter. The town of Iditarod holds a special place in Alaska's history as the original terminus of the famous dog sled trail that bears its name. Founded in 1910, during a gold rush it grew quickly into a substantial community with hotels, saloons, and stores. At its peak, nearly 10,000 people called Iditarod home. But like so many boom towns, its prosperity was built on a finite resource. When the easily accessible gold was exhausted by the early 1920s, the population began to decline rapidly. The final blow came in 1929 when a devastating fire destroyed most of the commercial district. Rather than rebuild, most residents simply abandoned their homes and businesses. Today, Iditarod is a scattered collection of building foundations, collapsed structures, and a handful of buildings that have survived. The Alaska Heritage Foundation designated it a protected historical site in 1998, recognizing its importance to the state's mining heritage and its connection to the Iditarod trail sled dog race. My assignment was to spend the winter of 2023 to 2024 there, conducting a comprehensive survey of the remaining structures and developing a long-term preservation plan. It would be my first extended stay, though I had visited before during summer surveys. Winter preservation work is challenging but necessary, as the extreme cold and snow loads reveal structural problems that aren't apparent in warmer months. I arrived in early November, flying in by bush plane and landing on a frozen lake about 2 miles from the town site. My supplies included everything necessary for a 4-month solo stay. I had also brought extensive research materials, hoping to correlate my findings with historical records and photographs. My base camp was in one of the few buildings still substantial enough to provide shelter, a 2-story boarding house. The building required significant temporary repairs to make it habitable, but it provided the secure workspace I needed. The first few weeks passed uneventfully as I settled into the routine of winter preservation. Days were short, but the long evenings gave me time to organize my findings. The isolation was complete but not unpleasant. I've always found solace in the silence of abandoned places. It was during my 3rd week that I first noticed signs of other human presence. I began finding footprints in the snow around the buildings I was surveying, fresh tracks that appeared overnight and followed no logical pattern. The prints were made by boots typical of early 20th century workwear. At first, I assumed they were other researchers or locals, but when I tried to follow the trails, they invariably led to impossible areas. The middle of collapsed buildings, the edges of deep ravines, or simply dead ends. More disturbing was the discovery that the footprints appeared to be made by multiple individuals. I could identify at least 6 different boot patterns suggesting a group of people. But despite setting up motion-activated cameras and watching carefully, I never saw any living person in Iditarod other than myself. The footprints were accompanied by other signs of activity. I would arrive at buildings in the morning to find doors that had been securely closed, now wide open. Tools I had carefully organized would be rearranged. Most unsettling were the sounds that began occurring during the long winter nights. I would hear hammering, sawing, and the creaking of timber, suggesting active construction somewhere in the town. The sounds were too regular and purposeful to be caused by wind, and they always seemed to come from areas where I knew no substantial buildings remained. One particularly clear night in December, I decided to investigate directly. Armed with a powerful flashlight and my heaviest winter gear, I followed the sounds toward what had been the main commercial district. The temperature was nearly 40 degrees below zero, but I was determined to solve the mystery. The sounds led me to the foundation of what had been the town's largest hotel, a 3-story structure that had burned in the 1929 fire. Nothing remained above ground except scattered stones and twisted metal fixtures, but the sounds of construction were clearly coming from this location. When I approached and shined my flashlight into the excavated area, I saw something that challenged every assumption I had. The hotel was being rebuilt, not by living people using modern techniques, but by translucent figures wearing the work clothes and using the hand tools of early 20th century construction crews. I could see at least a dozen men working with purposeful efficiency, raising walls and installing roof beams. The phantom crew appeared solid enough to handle heavy timber, but I could see through them to the frozen ground. They worked without speaking, communicating through gestures. Their movements had the fluid precision of experienced builders. As I watched, one of the workers looked up and made direct eye contact. He was a man in his 40s, with a thick beard and a weathered face. When he saw me, he smiled and touched the brim of his cap, then returned to his work as if my presence was expected. I stood there for what felt like hours, documenting this supernatural project with my camera. The phantom workers continued their tasks without pause, gradually rebuilding portions of the hotel that had been destroyed nearly a century earlier. Their work followed the original architectural plans perfectly. As dawn approached, the phantom crew gradually faded away, leaving no physical evidence of their labors. The hotel foundation remained as empty and ruined as it had been, but the experience had fundamentally changed my understanding of what historical preservation means. I realized that I wasn't alone in Iditarod, and that my role as caretaker was being shared with the spirits of people who had built this community and were unwilling to let it disappear. Over the remaining months, I continued to witness the phantom crews working. Different groups appeared to be responsible for different buildings, each focused on reconstructing the structures they had originally built. They worked only at night and only during the coldest months, as if the extreme conditions made it easier for them to manifest. I began to understand that these spirits were not haunting Iditarod in the traditional sense of being trapped. Instead, they were continuing the work they had done in life. They were the original preservationists, refusing to allow their town to fade into oblivion. My final report to the Alaska Heritage Foundation focused on conventional preservation, but I included a separate confidential addendum documenting the supernatural activities. I recommended that Iditarod be maintained as a protected site, not just for its historical significance, but as recognition that some places retain the active presence of the people who created them. The Foundation accepted my recommendations, though they never commented officially on my observations. But I know that other caretakers who have spent extended time at the site have reported similar experiences, and there is an unspoken understanding among preservationists that some locations require protection not just of their physical remains, but of the spirits that continue to inhabit them. I have returned to Iditarod several times since that winter, always during the coldest months when the phantom crews are most active. They have come to accept my presence, occasionally acknowledging me with nods but never interfering. We are partners in the same mission, ensuring that Iditarod and its stories survive. The ghost town continues to decay, but it will never be truly abandoned as long as its original builders continue their eternal construction project. Metal detecting in ghost towns has always been my weekend escape, a way to combine my professional interest in geology with the thrill of discovering artifacts that tell the stories of Alaska's mining past. My name is Ashley Martinez, and I'm 33 years old. I work as a geological survey technician for the state, but on weekends I pack my metal detector and head for the wilderness, searching through abandoned settlements for the small treasures that previous inhabitants left behind. Most of my finds are common items: nails, coins, pieces of equipment. Occasionally I discover something more significant, like a gold nugget or vintage jewelry. But it was the discovery of an old prospector's map that led me into the most terrifying experience of my life. I found the map in August 2023 while exploring the ruins of Chisana, a gold rush town that had flourished briefly between 1913 and 1915. Chisana was unusual because its gold was discovered so late in the territorial period, creating what some historians call the last great gold rush. At its peak, Chisana supported nearly 5,000 residents, but by 1916 the population had dwindled to fewer than 100. Today, Chisana is a remote collection of collapsed cabins and scattered debris. The map was hidden inside a rusted coffee tin that I discovered buried beneath the floorboards of a miner's cabin. The tin also contained gold coins and personal letters, but it was the hand-drawn map that captured my attention. It showed the Chisana area in remarkable detail and was covered with notations indicating potential gold deposits. The map was signed and dated Samuel Kowalski, September 1914. I knew that 1914 was the peak year of production. If this map was genuine, it had significant historical value. But what made it truly intriguing were the notations in red ink around one particular creek. Do not dig here after dark. Strange sounds from underground. And most ominously, Johnson and Miller disappeared October 15th. Avoid this area. My scientific training made me skeptical, but I was curious enough to plan a follow-up expedition. The creek drainage was about 5 miles from the main town site, accessible by a challenging hike. I returned 2 weeks later, equipped for a 3-day expedition. The weather was perfect. I planned to spend the first day hiking to the creek, setting up camp, and then spending 2 full days searching the area. The hike was more difficult than I had anticipated. When I finally reached the area, I found clear signs of extensive prospecting. Hand-dug pits and the remains of sluice boxes. I established my camp, but the area was eerily quiet, with none of the wildlife sounds that usually fill Alaska's wilderness. Even during the brief twilight, the silence was complete and oppressive. I began my metal detecting survey the next morning. The detector immediately registered hits, and within the first few hours I had recovered coins, equipment, and personal items. But as the day progressed, I began finding objects that didn't fit the pattern. Pieces of clothing buried in the gravel, several pairs of boots showing signs of hasty removal. Most disturbing were the personal items, pocket watches, wedding rings that appeared to have been dropped. It was while excavating around a particularly strong signal that I made the discovery that changed everything. About 3 feet down in a test pit, I found human bones. My training included enough forensic knowledge to recognize that these were not ancient remains. The bones showed evidence of trauma and were scattered in a pattern that suggested the bodies had been torn apart by some tremendous force. This was not a single accident, but evidence of multiple violent deaths. I should have stopped and contacted authorities, but my scientific curiosity overcame my better judgment. I continued excavating and found more evidence of violent deaths, shredded clothing, and broken tools. The pattern of bone distribution suggested that whatever had killed these miners had also partially consumed their remains. The sun was beginning to set by the time I realized how much I had uncovered. I had excavated an area nearly 10 feet square and 3 feet deep, revealing what was clearly a mass grave containing the remains of at least 6 individuals. The implications were staggering. I was photographing the site when I heard the sound that Samuel Kowalski had warned about. Strange noises from underground. It began as a low rumbling, but gradually it resolved into something more disturbing, the sound of digging, as if something large and powerful were excavating tunnels beneath the creek bed. The digging was accompanied by what could only be described as breathing deep and rhythmic inhalations that suggested something enormous was moving through subterranean passages. As darkness fell, the underground sounds grew louder. I could hear multiple creatures moving. Whatever was down there was large enough to displace significant amounts of earth. I retreated to my campsite, trying to convince myself I was hearing natural geological phenomena. But the sounds were too purposeful, too biological. Around midnight, something began emerging from the excavation site. I first noticed movement in my peripheral vision, dark shapes rising from the pit. When I focused my flashlight on the area, I saw creatures that defied every principle of biology I understood. They were roughly humanoid, but far larger, with elongated limbs that ended in claws. Their skin was pale and translucent, and most horrifying were their faces, which retained enough human characteristics to suggest that these creatures had once been people. The miners who had disappeared in 1914 had not been killed. They had been transformed. The creatures showed no immediate hostility toward me, but they were clearly reclaiming the excavation site. Using their massive claws, they began refilling the pit with remarkable speed, carefully reburying the bones and artifacts. One of them paused and looked directly at me. In its face, I could see traces of what had once been human intelligence. When it spoke, its voice was distorted but still recognizably that of a person. "You should not have dug here," it said, echoing the warning on the map. "Some gold comes at too high a price." I spent the rest of the night huddled in my tent, listening to the sounds of the creatures working to erase all evidence of my excavation. By dawn, they had disappeared back into their underground realm, leaving the valley exactly as I had found. Yet even my metal detector could no longer locate the artifacts. I hiked back to Chisana that morning and flew out on the first available charter, taking the map with me as the only proof of what I had discovered. I have never returned to that creek drainage, and I have never reported the location of the mass grave. Some secrets are meant to remain buried, protected by guardians who have paid the ultimate price for disturbing forces that should be left alone. The prospector's map remains in my possession, a reminder that Alaska's gold rush history includes chapters that were never meant to be written. Somewhere in the remote valleys near Chisana, the transformed miners continue their eternal vigil, ensuring that the price they paid for their greed remains hidden beneath the earth where it belongs.